going on, guys? We're back in the shop today and for another edition of What to Throw Wednesday, episode 2. And I want to talk to you about how the weather is changing and progressing through our winter period here and different stages of the winter. So last week we touched base a little bit on this area and which be Midwestern area and a little bit on the South, and we're going to do that again this week, but with the weather that we've had over the last week and what we should expect those fish to be doing. So I'll start with the Midwest. We had a little bit of a front come through. I guess it was on Sunday evening, and dumped a little bit of snow to the south of us. Not much here. Brutally cold on Monday. Highs in the upper 20s. A lot of wind. Pretty chilly. Tuesday, things started to warm up a little bit. And then here today on Wednesday, we have had another front come through. And the temperature's dropping drastically. Had some rain and now transitioning into snow. The next 2 days, Thursday and Friday, are going to be very cold. Highs in the upper 20s. So last week we talked about spoon fishing, fishing the spoon, blade bait, those kind of things. I don't expect that to have changed much. Once these fish hit their kind of winter area, they're not going to move very far. They're not going to move very much. So once you kind of find them, you can kind of stay with them to an extent. Now, in the wintertime, they just occupy a smaller percentage of the water column. Your blade baits, your jigging spoons, those things are still going to play. One thing I would really start to look at on those 45-degree banks that are lead-in banks into pockets, where those fish would tend to winter at, or close to a river channel swing or something of that nature, is I would start looking at a football jig. Football jig's good all year, but it can be really good in the wintertime when those fish are down and they're wallowing. That is when a jig can really play, because those fish are down and they're on the bottom and they're rooting and they're basically more or less looking for crawfish. Football jig, very effective. What I would definitely do is I would pick a trailer that doesn't have a lot of action. Something that's big or bulky that would cause this jig to fall a little slower, but doesn't have a ton of action. One little sneaky thing to keep in mind if you're fishing a lake that has a lot of rock, a Cumberland, a Dale Hollow, Rough River Lake, look for the rock transitions. Bank transitions from a chunk rock to a gravel, or from a boulder size rock or bluff to a chunk rock. Anywhere there's a rock transition, especially if it's on that kind of 45-degree angling bank, there are little things sometimes that people don't pay attention to so much, is that seam where the rock makes that transition. In the South, what you guys had down there was a lot of snow, depending upon how far south, of course. Had a lot of snow, southern Kentucky, Tennessee area, last week on Sunday, I guess it was. So now what you're facing is those water temperatures were warmer. You could get away with the chatterbait. You could get away with a few things, your jerk baits and all that. And some of those will still play. As it's warmed back up, that snow is starting to melt. So this is going to do two things to your water, or potentially could. Number one, and guaranteed, it is going to cool your water. As that snow melts and as that runoff enters your lake, the water temperatures are going to continue to drop. What happens is they drop at a fairly drastic rate. That is going to send a jolt to the system for the fishery. So fishing is going to be tough for a few days. Now, as long as the water stays clean, I would still look at a jerkbait. This is a Lucky Craft jerkbait, and it's a slow sinking model. Now, why throw a slow sinking model when the water is really cold is because when the water gets colder, it's more dense, and you may have heard me talk about that last week. That will actually cause a bait that is a suspending bait or a slow rising bait to rise more rapidly or not dive as deep because the water is so dense. So I opt to go with a slow sinking model because I can pause that bait and I can get that slow sink and I can get a little bit more depth out of that bait. Next thing is cadence. You have to play around with this, kind of figure it out, and you can watch my different jerkbait videos. I'll tag it right here for you to check that out. But cadence is key. Once you figure out the cadence, you can get the bites. But I'm going to start off pretty slow, probably a good 10 to 12 second pause between twitches. And I say twitches instead of jerks. If the water's in the 40s, upper 40s, close to 50, they become jerks, more erratic. This time of year, it is twitches. That bait needs to not move very far. And what's great about this particular Lucky Craft jerkbait is when you twitch it, when it goes forward, even though it's a slow sinking model, it actually slightly backs back up. When that bait's pausing, it's actually still working. Even though it's sitting there, that bait's actually sliding backwards, and it's still giving that bait some action without being overpowering. So definitely something I would look at with a jerkbait. I would just slow it down if your water stays clean. That's a lot of times what happens when you have a drastic cool down is those fish will suspend, and that's where the underspin will come into play. You can rig this with a couple different things. A fluke style bait, and you're just going to throw that out there in these same areas that you would fish the football jig, those transitioning banks, those rock changes. But you're going to fish it for fish that are out off the bank a little bit, and you're just going to slow reel that bait back to the boat. If you can fish it with a swim bait, a traditional paddle tail, I would try not to use one that has a wide wobble. I would keep one that has a much tighter action if possible. But a fluke style bait typically tends to work the best. If your water is gotten really cold and muddy, I would advise that you just stay home for a few days. It is really so. What happens is when that scenario takes place, the fish get really hard to catch. The only thing I've ever had success with in that dirty cold water is to go with a bright color crankbait. And this is a Bomber Model A, just an old school crankbait. This will go down 6-7 feet. And that's kind of the depth range we're looking at. And just crawl it. But just keep this bait in contact with the bottom and just have it crawling across the bottom pretty slow. And that is one way you can catch them in that cold, dirty water. But the bites are few and far between, guys. So if you can stay home, stay home. Wait for a little bit nicer day. Clear cold water, no big deal. Muddy cold water, not so good. Thanks for staying tuned, guys. We will see you next week. As always, like, subscribe, and share it. Y'all have a good week.